My father disowned me in front of 120 guests. Your sister gets the entire $185 million. You are lucky I still let you use my name. My mother laughed. I walked out. The next morning, a lawyer handed me a 29-year-old hospital bracelet. My name was not on it. I looked up. He said, "That is why we are here." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The crystal chandeliers of the Atlanta Grand Ballroom cast a golden glow over the crowd, but I felt completely frozen. Tonight was supposed to be the 30th anniversary gala for Caldwell Holdings. It was our family real estate empire. I stood near the back of the room holding my breath as my adoptive father, Desmond Caldwell, took the podium. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and looked out over the sea of wealthy African-American elites, doctors and investors and politicians all waiting for his speech. I had spent the last weeks organizing this entire event. I picked out the floral arrangements and coordinated the catering and managed the guest list. I did everything perfectly, hoping that just for one night he would look at me with pride. Instead, he leaned into the microphone and let his eyes lock onto mine. The room went completely silent. He did not thank his family. He did not thank his loyal employees. He pointed a steady accusing finger right at me. "You do not belong in this family portrait." The words echoed through the massive ballroom. My heart slammed against my ribs. People turned around in their seats to stare at me. Women in designer gowns whispered behind their hands. Men in tailored suits exchanged uncomfortable glances. Desmond did not lower his finger. He kept his voice steady and ruthless. "For years we tried to make you fit into the Caldwell legacy. We gave you a roof and food and a name. But tonight I am making things right. I am officially announcing that my true daughter Chantel will inherit the entire $185 million empire. You, Naomi, get nothing. You are lucky I still let you use my name." A collective gasp rippled through the room. My sister Chantel stood near the front row wearing a custom silver gown that cost more than my car. She did not look shocked. She looked triumphant. She leaned into her husband Preston and smiled. I could not breathe. My feet felt glued to the marble floor. 29 years of trying to be the perfect daughter were destroyed in less than a minute. I had always been the black sheep. I was the one who was never quite smart enough or pretty enough or obedient enough. But being publicly humiliated in front of the entire city elite was a new level of cruelty. Before I could even process the humiliation, a shadow fell over me. It was Preston. Chantel had married him 3 years ago. He was a white venture capitalist from a wealthy family who loved to use my family money to fund his failed startups. He walked up to me with a crystal glass of red wine in his hand. His blue eyes were gleaming with arrogance. "Well, this is embarrassing for you," Preston said, his voice loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. He looked me up and down, taking in my simple black dress. I had bought it on sale last month because Desmond refused to pay for my gala attire. "You really thought you could stand in the same room as us and pretend you are an equal?" I clenched my fists. "Leave me alone, Preston." I took a step closer, invading my personal space. He tilted his wine glass slightly. "You know what your problem is, Naomi. You forgot your place. You are just a parasite draining my wife and her family. You should get a mop and make yourself useful." With a flick of his wrist, he tipped the glass. The dark red wine splashed directly onto the front of my dress. The cold liquid soaked through the thin fabric instantly. I gasped and stepped back, but the damage was done. A huge dark stain spread across my chest, making me look exactly like the messy failure they always claimed I was. "Oops," Preston smirked. "How clumsy of me." Tears pricked the corners of my eyes. I refused to let them fall. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me cry. I looked around desperately for anyone to help me. My eyes found Valerie. My adoptive mother was walking toward us. Her posture was rigid, and her expression was pure ice. For a brief second, a foolish part of me hoped she would scold Preston. I hoped she would finally act like a mother and protect me. Instead, she stopped right in front of me and let out a heavy sigh of disgust. "Look at the mess you are making," Valerie said. "Mom," he poured wine on me. I whispered, my voice trembling. Valerie did not even look at the stain, her eyes fixed on the simple pearl necklace resting against my collarbone. It was the only gift she had ever given me. She bought it for my 16th birthday. It was the one piece of jewelry I cherished because it made me feel like I actually belonged to her. "Take that off," Valerie demanded. I blinked in confusion. "What?" "Give that back to Chantel right now." Valerie reached out and aggressively grabbed the pearls. The chain dug painfully into the back of my neck. "Your skin is too dark, Naomi. You make the pearls look dirty. Look at your sister. That is what perfection looks like." With a violent yank, she unclasped the necklace. The metal scraped my skin, leaving a burning red mark. She held the pearls in her hand as if they were a prize she had reclaimed from a thief. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of her words. "Your skin is too dark." That was it. That was the core of my entire existence in this house. For 29 years, I was punished for the color of my skin and the shape of my features. I was forced to use heavy concealer every single day to cover a crescent moon birthmark on the back of my neck because Valerie said it made me look like street trash. I was paraded around as their charitable good deed, but treated like a servant behind closed doors. I looked at Valerie. I looked at Preston, who was still smirking. I looked at Desmond on the stage, receiving applause from people who had no idea what kind of monster he was. Suddenly, the sadness vanished. The desperate need for their approval evaporated. A cold, heavy realization settled in my chest. These people did not love me. They never loved me. They were using me as a punching bag to make themselves feel powerful. Valerie stared at me, expecting me to apologize. She expected me to lower my head and beg for forgiveness like I always did. Instead, I reached up to my ears. I unhooked the matching pearl earrings she had given me. I held them over the puddle of spilled wine on the floor. I opened my hand and let them drop. The pearls hit the marble with a sharp clatter and rolled into the red mess. Valerie gasped in outrage. "How dare you? Keep your trash," I said, my voice steady and loud enough for everyone around us to hear. "And keep your last name. I am done paying for it with my dignity." I turned my back on them. I did not run. I walked with my head held high through the center of the ballroom. I felt the eyes of 120 guests watching my stained dress, but I did not care. The heavy wooden doors of the hotel lobby opened, and I stepped out into the freezing Atlanta night. The rain was pouring down in thick, heavy sheets. It soaked my hair and washed the spilled wine down the fabric of my dress. The cold wind cut through me, but I kept walking. I had no car. I had no money in my bank account because Desmond controlled my finances. I had nothing but the clothes on my back. But for the first time in 29 years, I felt completely free. I walked down the wet street, shivering as the storm raged around me. The streetlights reflected off the puddles on the pavement. I did not know where I was going to sleep tonight. I did not know how I was going to survive tomorrow. Suddenly, the bright glare of headlights blinded me. A massive black Maybach swerved violently toward the curb and slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched against the wet asphalt. Water splashed onto the sidewalk. The bulletproof vehicle stopped right beside me. I froze. My heart hammered in my throat. I thought Desmond had sent his security team to drag me back to the gala to punish me further. The back door of the Maybach swung open. A man stepped out into the pouring rain. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, wearing a sharp-tailored suit that screamed immense wealth. He opened a large black umbrella and stepped toward me, shielding me from the rain. "Naomi Caldwell?" he asked. His voice was deep and commanding. I took a step back, my guard instantly up. "I do not use that last name anymore. Who are you?" He did not introduce himself. He did not smile. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small sealed plastic evidence bag. He held it out to me. "Take it," he instructed. My hands were shaking from the cold. I reached out and took the bag. Inside was a faded, crumbling piece of plastic. It was a hospital bracelet, the kind they put on newborn babies. The plastic was yellowed with age, but the black ink printed on the label was still clearly legible. I squinted through the rain to read the words. Baby girl Sterling. Date of birth, October 12, 1997. My breath caught in my throat. That was my exact date of birth. But the name was completely wrong. My birth certificate said Naomi Caldwell. My parents told me I was born at a small clinic in a different county. They never mentioned the name Sterling. I looked up at the stranger. The rain pounded against the umbrella above us. I do not understand. What is this? Whose name is this? The lawyer looked me directly in the eyes. His expression was completely serious. Your name is not Naomi Caldwell. It never was. He pointed to the bracelet in my trembling hand. You are baby girl Sterling. And that is why we are here. Please get in the car. Your real father does not have much time left, and he wants his empire back. The world around me seemed to stop. The noise of the rain faded into the background. The pain of the gala, the spilled wine, the stolen pearls, all of it vanished in the wake of those words. My real father. An empire. I looked back toward the hotel where Desmond and Valerie were busy celebrating their perfect legacy. They thought they had buried me tonight. They thought they had left me with absolutely nothing. They had no idea that they had just set me free to find out exactly who I really was. I gripped the hospital bracelet tightly in my hand. I stepped out of the cold rain and slid into the warm leather seat of the Maybach. Take me to him, I said. The door closed, shutting out the storm. As the car sped away into the night, a new chapter of my life began. The Caldwell family wanted to play games with my life. They wanted to steal my dignity and humiliate me for sport. But they were about to learn a very hard lesson. You should never throw a match into a room full of gasoline and expect to walk away without getting burned. I was going to find out the truth about baby girl Sterling. And when I did, I was going to take back everything they had stolen from me. Every single penny. Every single drop of pride. They were going to pay. The heavy silence inside the Maybach was a sharp contrast to the violent storm raging outside the tinted windows. The plush leather seats offered a warmth I had not felt in years. I sat perfectly still, holding the faded hospital bracelet in my damp hands. The man sitting across from me had introduced himself as Harrison. He did not say another word as the driver navigated through the flooded streets of Atlanta. I looked down at the small piece of plastic again. Baby girl Sterling. The name felt foreign, but it also carried a strange sense of belonging. My entire life with the Caldwell family had been a carefully constructed lie. Every insult about my dark skin and every punishment for outshining Chantel suddenly made a sick kind of sense. I was not their blood, I was their captive. The car turned off the main highway and approached a highly secure private medical facility hidden behind a thick perimeter of tall pine trees. Armed guards stood at the iron gates. They recognized the vehicle and immediately granted us access. The tires glided smoothly over the wet pavement before coming to a halt beneath a brightly lit canopy. Harrison stepped out first and opened my door. He led me through the glass entrance and down a series of pristine white corridors. The air smelled of strong antiseptic and quiet desperation. There were no other patients in this wing. We stopped in front of a heavy oak door at the end of the hall. Harrison placed his hand on the brass handle and looked at me with a solemn expression. "Hai has been waiting for this day for 29 years, Harrison said quietly. Please be gentle with him. The doctors say his heart is failing rapidly. Harrison pushed the door open. I walked into a massive suite that looked more like a luxury hotel room than a hospital ward. Medical monitors beeped rhythmically in the background. Propped up against a mountain of white pillows was a man who looked terribly frail but possessed an undeniable presence. His dark skin was pale with illness, but his eyes were sharp and piercing. They were the exact same shape as my own. I stopped breathing for a second. Looking at him was like looking into a mirror that showed my future. This was Lawrence Sterling, a legendary tech billionaire who lived entirely off the grid. "Come closer, child," Lawrence whispered. His voice was raspy but thick with emotion. I took a hesitant step forward. My wet dress clung uncomfortably to my skin, but I did not care. I stopped beside his bed. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up a worn leather wallet from his bedside table. He opened it slowly and pulled out a small, faded photograph. He held it out to me. I took the picture and stared at it. It was a Polaroid of a newborn baby girl sleeping peacefully in a hospital bassinet. Turn it over, Lawrence instructed gently. I flipped the photograph. On the back of the picture, there was a handwritten note with the date of my birth. But what made my heart stop was the image itself. The baby was lying on her stomach, and clearly visible on the back of her tiny neck was a dark birthmark shaped exactly like a crescent moon. I reached up and touched the back of my own neck right where the heavy layer of expensive waterproof concealer covered my skin. Valerie hated that birthmark. Every morning before school, she would drag me into the bathroom and aggressively apply thick makeup over the back of my neck. She told me it was an ugly blemish. She said it made me look cheap and common. She punished me if I ever washed the makeup off in public. I had spent my entire life feeling ashamed of the one thing that proved who I really was. "You are my daughter," Lawrence said, his voice breaking. "My beautiful, brilliant daughter." Tears spilled down my cheeks. I wiped them away with the back of my hand. Why did they take me? I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of grief and rising anger. Why did the Caldwell family steal me just to treat me like garbage? Lawrence closed his eyes and let out a long, heavy sigh. Because Desmond Caldwell was nothing before he met me. 29 years ago, Desmond was just my lowly assistant. He fetched my coffee and carried my briefcase. I trusted him. I had just developed a revolutionary software patent that was going to change the real estate industry forever. It was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Desmond knew the value of my work. He grew greedy and resentful. He wanted the empire for himself. Lawrence paused to catch his breath. The heart monitor beeped slightly faster. Harrison stepped forward to pour a glass of water, but Lawrence waved him away. One rainy night, Desmond orchestrated a horrific car crash. Lawrence continued, his eyes burning with fresh tears. My wife and I were driving home from the hospital. You were only 2 days old. Desmond paid a driver to run our car off the highway. The crash paralyzed my beautiful wife from the waist down. While I was trapped in the wreckage, Desmond broke into my private safe and stole the core patent documents. He used my technology to build Caldwell Holdings. He built his entire $185 million empire on my stolen blood and sweat. I felt physically sick. The lavish lifestyle Chantel and Preston enjoyed was funded by my true father. But the story was not over. It gets worse, Lawrence whispered. Valerie had just suffered a severe miscarriage that same week. She was grieving and deeply unstable. When she found out you survived the crash, she walked right into the chaos of the emergency room and took you. The hospital was completely overwhelmed with casualties from a massive storm. Valerie just slipped out the back door with my newborn baby. She and Desmond raised the daughter of their enemy as a punching bag. They kept you close so they could satisfy their sick, twisted egos by breaking you down every single day. They wanted to punish me by destroying my child. The sheer malice of their plan hit me like a physical blow. 29 years of emotional torture. 29 years of watching Chantel receive cars and vacations and endless praise while I was handed scraps and told I was worthless. They did not just steal my family, they stole my peace of mind. I need to hear it from her, I said, my voice suddenly going dead and hollow. I pulled my cell phone from my damp purse. My hands had stopped shaking. A new icy calm had taken over my body. I dialed Valerie. The phone rang 4 times before she answered. The loud background noise of the anniversary gala echoed through the speaker. I could hear glasses clinking and people laughing. Valerie sounded heavily intoxicated. "What do you want, Naomi?" Valerie slurred, her tone dripping with annoyance. "If you are calling to apologize, you can forget it. Preston already threw away your dirty earrings. Do not even think about coming back to this hotel." I kept my voice perfectly flat and submissive, playing the role of the scared daughter she expected me to be. "Mom, I am sorry. I just need one thing and then I will leave you alone. I am applying for a job out of state tomorrow morning, and they need my original birth certificate for the background check. Can you tell me where it is in the house?" Valerie let out a loud, obnoxious screech of laughter. A nearby guest asked her what was so funny, and she proudly told them her failure of a daughter was begging for favors. "What do you need a birth certificate for?" Valerie yelled into the phone. "You have no rights in my house. You have no rights to anything with the Caldwell name. I do not have your birth certificate because you were never really mine. I should have left you in a dumpster instead of picking you up to be a shadow for Chantel. You are nothing but a stolen mistake. You should be thanking me on your knees for giving you a bed to sleep in. Do not ever call this number again." The line went dead. The brutal truth was confirmed. Valerie had just admitted to picking me up rather than giving birth to me. The complete lack of maternal hesitation in her voice was the final nail in the coffin. Whatever remaining love or loyalty I had for the Caldwell family evaporated into the cold hospital air. My heartbreak instantly hardened into absolute freezing rage. They had ruined my life for sport. I placed my phone back into my purse. I looked at Lawrence. He reached out and wrapped his frail hand around mine. His grip was surprisingly strong. "That $185 million empire," Lawrence said, looking deeply into my eyes. "It was built on my stolen legacy. It belongs to you, Naomi. Everything I have left is yours." I wiped the final tear from my cheek. I squeezed his hand back. "I am not Naomi Caldwell anymore," I said, my voice laced with venom. "They have had 29 years of stolen luxury. They have paraded around Atlanta acting like royalty while treating me like a peasant. It is time to collect the debt. I am going to take every single thing they love and burn it to the ground." Lawrence smiled for the first time. It was a proud, dangerous smile. Harrison stepped closer to the bed, pulling a sleek tablet from his jacket pocket. He looked at the screen and frowned. His professional demeanor shifted into high alert. "We have a situation," Harrison said, tapping the screen quickly. "I just received a secure text from our financial informants on Wall Street. Desmond knows that his core company assets are starting to attract federal attention due to some careless tax filings. He is trying to move his money out of the country, and he is using your brother-in-law to do it, Preston." I asked, my eyes narrowing at the thought of the arrogant white man who had poured wine on me just an hour ago. "Yes," Harrison confirmed. "Preston is greedy and eager to secure what he believes is his new inheritance since Desmond publicly named Chantel as the sole heir tonight. Preston is attempting to urgently launder $50 million. He is using a fake fine art purchase to move Desmond's liquid assets to offshore Swiss accounts. He thinks he can buy a forged collection of European paintings and declare them as a massive corporate loss to hide the money transfer. The deal is supposed to close first thing tomorrow morning." A slow, cold smile spread across my face. Desmond and Preston thought I was just a useless burden. They constantly mocked me for refusing to work at their real estate firm. They called my independent career a joke. They had absolutely no idea what I actually did for a living because they never cared enough to ask. They did not know that for the past 7 years I had been building my own reputation under my middle name. I was one of the most elite, highly sought-after fine art appraisers and forensic authenticators on the entire East Coast. Museums and private collectors paid me hundreds of thousands of dollars to verify the legitimacy of classic masterpieces. "Where is Preston making this purchase?" I asked, turning to Harrison. "At the Grand Exhibition Gallery downtown," Harrison replied. "He is meeting with his private investors at 9 in the morning to authorize the wire transfer." I looked down at my wine-stained dress. I needed a shower and a new tailored suit. I needed to look like the predator I was about to become. "Harrison," I said, standing up straight. "Contact the gallery owner. Tell them they have a new lead appraiser inspecting the collection tomorrow morning before any sale is finalized. Tell them the buyer requested it. Preston wants to play games with stolen money. I am going to show him exactly what a parasite looks like when it destroys the host from the inside out." Lawrence watched me with absolute pride. The monitor beside his bed hummed a steady rhythm matching the new, powerful beat of my own heart. The Caldwells thought they had won the war tonight, but they had simply handed me the exact weapon I needed to slaughter them. Tomorrow morning, Preston was going to lose $50 million, and that was only the beginning. The rain continued to batter the large hospital windows, but the storm inside me had settled into a sharp, focused strategy. For 29 years, I had played the role of the quiet, obedient victim. I absorbed their insults because I thought I owed them gratitude for giving me a home. I let Chantel parade her expensive gifts in my face because I believed I was unworthy of nice things. I let Preston make degrading jokes about my race and my background because Valerie always told me to keep my mouth shut and know my place. I thought about all the holidays where I was forced to sit at the end of the table. I thought about the graduation ceremony where Desmond refused to show up because he said my degree was a waste of time. I thought about the sheer unadulterated evil of Valerie kidnapping a grieving mother's baby just to torture her out of spite. They did not just steal my inheritance. They stole a lifetime of memories with a father who loved me. They stole my true identity. They made me hate my own skin. They made me hate the beautiful crescent moon birthmark that tied me to my real family. I promised myself right then and there that I would never use concealer on the back of my neck ever again. The birthmark was a crown, and I was going to wear it proudly while I tore down the Caldwell Empire brick by brick. Harrison handed me a secure smartphone. "This device is encrypted," Harrison explained. "We have already transferred a substantial operating budget into a private account under your true legal name. You will have unlimited resources to execute this plan. Whatever you need, just say the word." I took the phone. Its heavy metallic casing felt like absolute power in the palm of my hand. The first thing I needed to do was destroy Preston's art deal. Preston was an arrogant fool who thought his white privilege and his marriage to the golden child made him invincible. He had a long history of investing in terrible startup companies and losing millions of Desmond's money. But Desmond always forgave him because Preston fit the perfect visual aesthetic for the Caldwell family image. This time there would be no forgiveness. When I exposed the $50 million art purchase as a federal money laundering scheme, the investors would run for the hills. Preston would be left holding the bag for a massive financial crime. The gallery owner would demand immediate compensation for the breach of contract. Preston would be utterly humiliated, and Desmond's offshore escape plan would be completely ruined. I looked back at Lawrence. He was resting his eyes, but his chest rose and fell with a calm, steady rhythm. He had fought hard to stay alive long enough to find me. Now it was my turn to fight for him. I would not let his legacy remain in the hands of criminals. "Get some sleep, Dad," I whispered, letting the word roll off my tongue for the first time. "I will handle the rest." I turned and walked out of the hospital suite with Harrison by my side. The hallway stretched out before me, bright and clear. Tomorrow morning, Preston and Chantel were going to walk into that art gallery, expecting to secure their stolen wealth. They were going to walk in feeling like kings and queens of Atlanta. But they were about to step into a slaughterhouse, and I was holding the blade. Here's the continuation of the script following your exact instructions. The morning sun broke through the heavy clouds over Atlanta, casting a sharp golden light across the city skyline. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of my hotel suite, holding a cup of black coffee. The storm from last night had finally passed, but the real destruction was only just beginning. I took a deep breath and let the cool air fill my lungs. For the first time in 29 years, I woke up without a crushing weight on my chest. I did not have to worry about Valerie calling me to criticize my hair or my clothes. I did not have to worry about Desmond reminding me how much money he spent feeding me. I was completely untethered from their toxic grip, but I was not walking away empty-handed. I was walking away with a battle plan. Harrison had arranged for a courier to deliver a garment bag to my room at dawn. I set my coffee down and unzipped the bag. Inside was a custom-tailored charcoal gray suit made of the finest Italian wool. I slipped it on and looked at myself in the mirror. The fit was absolutely perfect. The sharp lines of the blazer gave my shoulders a powerful, commanding shape. I pinned my dark hair back into a sleek, tight bun. I did not reach for the heavy waterproof concealer that I had used every single day of my life. I left the back of my neck completely bare. The dark crescent moon birthmark was visible for anyone to see. It was the mark of my true bloodline, and I was going to wear it like a badge of honor. Today, I was not the quiet, obedient scapegoat. Today, I was one of the most elite forensic art authenticators on the East Coast. And I was going to destroy the golden child and her arrogant husband before they could even finish their morning champagne. My phone buzzed on the vanity table. It was a message from Harrison confirming the details. Preston and his wealthy white investors were currently gathering at the prestigious Vanguard Fine Arts Gallery in the heart of downtown Atlanta. They were preparing to finalize the $50 million purchase. Preston thought he was brilliant. I thought he could buy a collection of European masterpieces and use the transaction to wash Desmond's dirty money before moving it into an offshore Swiss account. He thought he was saving the Caldwell Empire. He had no idea that I was the lead appraiser assigned to verify the collection. I grabbed my leather briefcase and walked out the door. A sleek black town car was waiting for me outside the hotel. The drive to the gallery took less than 20 minutes, but every second felt like a drum beating in my chest. The gallery was located in a historic brick building with massive arched windows. Expensive luxury cars were parked along the curb. Security guards stood at the entrance checking names on a digital guest list. I approached the main doors. The head of security held his hand up to stop me. He asked for my name. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I was the senior forensic appraiser requested by the buyer. He checked his tablet and nodded immediately, stepping aside to let me enter. The interior of the Vanguard Fine Arts Gallery was breathtakingly arrogant. The walls were painted a stark, pristine white, and the lighting was angled perfectly to highlight the massive oil paintings displayed around the room. Waiters in black vests circulated with trays of expensive champagne and tiny appetizers. In the center of the main exhibition hall stood Preston. He was wearing a ridiculous velvet blazer and holding a crystal flute of champagne. I was laughing loudly, surrounded by 3 older white men in expensive business suits. These were his investors, the men who were about to blindly throw $50 million into a federal money laundering scheme. Standing right next to Preston was my sister Chantel. She wore a tight red designer dress and her hair was styled in elaborate cascading curls. She was sipping her drink and flashing a massive new diamond ring at anyone who would look her way. She was completely intoxicated by the illusion of her own wealth. She thought she had won the grand prize last night when Desmond announced she would inherit the $185 million real estate empire. She thought I was currently crying in a gutter somewhere. I walked slowly across the polished hardwood floor. The sharp click of my heels echoed through the quiet hum of classical music playing in the background. I did not rush. I let every step announce my arrival. Preston was in the middle of telling a joke to his investors when he happened to turn his head. His eyes landed on me. The arrogant smile on his face completely vanished. He blinked twice as if he was looking at a ghost. Chantel noticed his sudden silence and followed his gaze. Her jaw dropped open. She nearly spilled her champagne. For a brief second, the two of them just stared at my tailored suit and my confident posture. Then Preston recovered his composure. A nasty, mocking smirk spread across his face. He nudged one of his investors and pointed his champagne glass right at me. "Look who is here!" Preston laughed loudly, making sure his voice carried across the gallery. "Did my father-in-law cutting you off last night force you to take a job as a gallery security guard? I guess you really did have to get a mop after all." Chantel let out a high-pitched, cruel laugh. She stepped forward, resting her hand on Preston's arm and flashing her diamond ring directly in my line of sight. "What are you doing here, Naomi? Did you come to beg for a handout? Because we are very busy conducting real business today. This is an exclusive viewing. You cannot just walk in here wearing a cheap suit and expect us to give you the time of day." The investors looked at me with varying degrees of confusion and disdain. They clearly believed I was some desperate estranged relative looking for a handout. I did not flinch. I did not show an ounce of emotion. I kept my face perfectly smooth and professional. I walked right past Chantel, completely ignoring her existence. I stopped in front of the main attraction. It was a massive 19th-century European landscape painting displayed on an ornate wooden easel. This was the centerpiece of the $50 million collection. I set my leather briefcase down on a small glass table. I popped the brass locks and opened it. I pulled out a pair of pristine white cotton appraiser gloves and slipped them onto my hands. Then I pulled out a high-powered magnifying loupe and a specialized ultraviolet light scanner. Preston watched me with growing confusion. "What do you think you are doing? Get away from that painting. It is extremely fragile." I turned to look at the investors. My voice was calm, steady, and coded in absolute authority. "Gentlemen, I am the senior forensic authenticator, assigned to verify the provenance and material integrity of this collection before any financial transaction is finalized. You requested an independent appraisal, and I am here to deliver it." Preston's face turned the color of chalk. "You are what? That is impossible. You work at a stupid soap shop or whatever it is. I ignored him completely. I turned my attention to the massive landscape painting. I leaned in close, bringing the magnifying loupe right up to the surface of the canvas. The entire gallery grew completely quiet. Even the waiters stopped moving. The investors stepped closer, watching me with intense interest. This piece is presented as an original masterwork from 1874. I began speaking in a crisp, analytical tone. However, a basic macro-level inspection reveals immediate inconsistencies. I turned on the ultraviolet scanner and swept the purple light across the bottom left corner of the painting. I pointed to a faint glowing residue. Notice the fluorescence of the pigment in this quadrant, I said, gesturing for the investors to look closer. Authentic 19th century artists utilized natural ultramarine and lead white, which do not fluoresce under shortwave ultraviolet light. The glowing signature you see right here indicates the presence of titanium dioxide. Titanium dioxide was not commercially available for artistic use until 1921. This means the pigment was applied at least 50 years after the artist supposedly died. One of the older investors frowned and leaned in to inspect the glowing patch. Are you absolutely certain about that? I am entirely certain, I replied smoothly. But let us move beyond the chemical composition and look at the physical canvas aging. I stepped to the side of the easel and ran my gloved finger along the raw, exposed edge of the canvas wrapped around the wooden stretcher bars. I pulled a small pair of tweezers from my pocket and gently teased a loose thread from the fabric. Historical canvases from the 19th century were woven using traditional linen, which oxidizes and becomes profoundly brittle over a century. I explained, holding the thread up to the light. This canvas, however, possesses a tensile strength that suggests it was artificially aged. Furthermore, if you examine the crack pattern on the surface known as craquelure, you will see that the fissures are completely uniform. Natural craquelure develops organically over decades, expanding in random, unpredictable patterns due to environmental fluctuations. These cracks were created by baking the canvas in a specialized thermal oven. This is a deliberate modern forgery. The gallery was completely silent. The investors stared at the painting in absolute shock. Preston was hyperventilating. Sweat beaded on his forehead. She is lying. Preston shouted, his voice cracking with panic. She is just a bitter, jealous family member trying to ruin my life. Do not listen to her. I have certificates of authenticity. I turned to face Preston and the investors. I did not raise my voice, but my words cut through the room like a sharp knife. Certificates of authenticity can be printed by anyone with a computer, I stated coldly. The chemical signature of titanium dioxide cannot be argued. This entire collection is forged. Its real value is under $5,000. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the room. I looked directly into the eyes of the lead investor. Gentlemen, anyone willing to authorize a $50 million wire for this collection is either criminally incompetent or actively committing federal money laundering. If you sign that contract today, the Federal Bureau of Investigation will seize your assets by tomorrow morning. The lead investor turned entirely red in the face. He glared at Preston with absolute pure hatred. You tried to sell us fake art to wash your dirty money, he spat. The deal is dead, Preston, and you will be hearing from my legal team by the end of the day. Do not ever contact me again. The investors turned in unison and marched out of the gallery. They did not look back. Preston stood frozen in the center of the room. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. He had just lost his investors. He had just lost Desmond's $50 million escape plan. And he was now legally responsible for the massive debt incurred by bringing the forged collection into the gallery in the first place. The gallery owner, who had been watching from the corner, marched over to Preston with a face like thunder. You promised me this deal was legitimate, the owner shouted. You owe me $200,000 in staging and security fees. I want my money, Preston, now. Chantel looked absolutely terrified. She grabbed Preston's arm, but he violently shoved her away. He glared at me, his eyes bloodshot and wild. He looked like a rabid animal trapped in a corner. You ruined me, Preston screamed, lunging toward me. You ruined everything, you miserable piece of trash. He raised his fist to strike me, but he never got the chance. Two massive gallery security guards tackled him to the hardwood floor before he could even take a full step. They pinned his arms behind his back while he thrashed and screamed obscenities. Chantel shrieked in horror, begging them to let her husband go, but the guards dragged Preston aggressively out the back door of the gallery. I calmly took off my white cotton gloves and placed them back inside my leather briefcase. I snapped the brass locks shut. I did not look at Chantel as she sobbed on the gallery floor. I simply walked out the front doors and stepped back into the bright morning sunlight. The air tasted sweet. I climbed back into the waiting town car and leaned my head against the leather seat. One target down. But I knew Desmond would not take this lying down. He was a ruthless corporate shark, and he was going to try to bite back. Sure enough, less than 20 minutes later, my phone began to ring. It was the director of my appraisal firm. Desmond had clearly received the frantic phone call from Preston and realized that I was the one who destroyed his massive money laundering scheme. Desmond still possessed powerful connections in the Atlanta business world. He had definitely pulled strings to demand my immediate termination in a desperate attempt to ruin my career in retaliation. I answered the phone, holding it to my ear. Naomi. The director said, his voice sounding incredibly strained and confused. I am so sorry to call you like this. We just received an overwhelming amount of pressure from Caldwell Holdings regarding your employment status. I know, I said calmly. Desmond wants me fired. Yes, the director hesitated. But there is a massive complication. I cannot fire you. Our entire firm was just bought out by a private holding company 5 minutes ago in a hostile cash takeover. The new chairman is currently sitting in the executive boardroom, and he specifically requested your presence. The new chairman wants you in the boardroom immediately. I smiled. The trap was perfectly set. I told the driver to head to my corporate office. Desmond thought he could use his money and influence to crush me. He thought he could strip away my livelihood just like he stripped away my family. But Desmond had no idea that he was playing checkers against a woman who owned the entire chessboard. I watched the Atlanta skyline pass by the window. The Caldwell family was fracturing. Preston was broke and publicly disgraced. Chantel was sobbing in an art gallery. Desmond was desperately trying to stop a bleeding wound that could not be stitched. And Valerie was sitting in her mansion, completely unaware that her worst nightmare was about to knock on her front door. They had spent my entire life trying to convince me I was nothing. Today I was going to prove that I was their absolute destruction. I took a deep breath and prepared for the next battle. The boardroom was waiting, and I was ready to take my throne. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the appraisal firm with my head held high and my posture completely straight. The atmosphere in the main lobby was usually bustling with arrogant associates, but today it was suffocatingly quiet. The receptionist, who usually ignored my presence or spoke to me with thinly veiled disdain, suddenly stood up straight and nervously pointed her trembling finger toward the executive boardroom down the hall. I did not say a single word to her. I just walked down the long corridor, feeling the heavy silence of the office pressing against the walls. Everyone in the building knew something massive had just happened, but nobody knew exactly what the change meant for their jobs. I pushed open the double oak doors of the executive suite, expecting to see the former director ready to hand me my termination papers. The room was empty, except for a large leather chair facing the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bustling Atlanta streets. I stepped fully into the room and the chair slowly spun around. It was not the firm director sitting there. It was Harrison. He sat behind the massive desk with a calm professional smile, resting his hands on a thick stack of crisp legal documents. He gestured for me to take a seat opposite him. I sat down across from him, and he smoothly slid the documents over the polished mahogany table. He explained in a steady voice that Lawrence Sterling had executed a hostile cash takeover of the entire appraisal firm less than an hour ago. The company no longer belonged to the previous board of directors who bowed to Desmond's influence. It belonged entirely to me. I looked down at the paperwork and saw my true name printed in bold black ink. Naomi Sterling, sole owner and chairman. The realization washed over me like a wave of pure electricity. Desmond thought he could have me fired and blacklisted from the fine art industry with one angry phone call. He thought he could strip away my livelihood and force me to crawl back to him. Instead, he had just pushed me into the highest seat of absolute power. I picked up the silver pen and signed the documents, feeling the immense weight of my new reality settling into my bones. Harrison nodded approvingly and told me that my first official act as chairman would be to authorize a complete audit of Caldwell Holdings' real estate assets. We were going to freeze them out of the market entirely. I gave the order immediately without a second of hesitation, using the immense financial leverage of the Sterling Empire. We initiated a series of aggressive corporate blocks against Desmond and his various shell companies. By late afternoon, the devastating effects were already rippling through the Atlanta business sector. Harrison received continuous updates from our dedicated financial team. Desmond's corporate credit lines were suddenly freezing one by one. His massive bank accounts were being flagged and locked down by anonymous corporate attacks that his team could not trace. Panic was rapidly setting in at the Caldwell corporate headquarters. Desmond and Valerie were bleeding money at an unprecedented rate, and they had absolutely no idea who was holding the knife to their throats. But they were cunning survivors, and they had ruthless lawyers on their payroll. Harrison informed me that their legal team had frantically searched for a desperate loophole to protect their personal wealth. To shield their remaining assets from any potential lawsuits regarding my past adoption and labor, they needed me to sign a post-disownment legal waiver. It was a binding document that would permanently sever any legal ties or financial claims I might have against their estate. They desperately needed my signature to save themselves from total ruin, and they were going to try to manipulate my emotions to get it. I was sitting in the quiet living room of my hotel suite later that evening when a sharp knock echoed from the front door. I already knew exactly who was standing on the other side. I walked over and pulled the door open. Valerie stood in the hallway, holding a designer handbag and wearing a perfectly tailored beige dress that made her look like the picture of suburban innocence. She looked around the luxurious hotel hallway with a hint of confusion before focusing her eyes on me. She did not look like the cruel monster who had aggressively ripped my pearl necklace off the night before at the gala. She had carefully arranged her face into a mask of pure maternal concern. She actually had real tears welling up in her eyes. She reached out and tried to gently touch my arm, but I took a deliberate step back to avoid her grasp. She let out a shaky, dramatic breath and asked if she could please come inside to talk. I stepped aside and let her enter the suite. I wanted to see exactly how far she would go to save her own skin and protect her stolen money. Valerie walked into the center of the living room and sat down delicately on the edge of the velvet sofa. She opened her expensive handbag and pulled out a folded piece of thick paper along with a sleek silver pen. She placed them gently on the glass coffee table. She looked up at me with a trembling lip and began her performance. She told me how terribly sorry she was about the events at the gala. She said that families fight all the time and people say horrible things they do not mean when they are angry or stressed. She told me she loved me deeply and that she had always considered me her true daughter, despite our obvious physical differences. It was the most convincing and sickening performance I had ever seen her give in 29 years. Valerie reached into her purse again and pulled out a certified bank check. She placed it right next to the legal waiver on the table. She told me that she and Desmond felt terrible about kicking me out and wanted to help me start over fresh. She said the check was for $100,000. All I had to do was sign the little piece of paper to make our separation official and amicable so we could both heal. She promised that the money would help me find a nice apartment and get back on my feet while I looked for a new job. She looked at me with those wide, pleading eyes, acting like a benevolent savior, throwing a lifeline to a drowning victim. I looked down at the check. $100,000 was absolute pocket change to them. It was a pathetic, insulting bribe meant to silence me forever and protect their stolen millions. I sat down in the armchair across from her and decided to play the exact role she needed me to play. I kept my expression soft and incredibly vulnerable. I looked down at my hands and pretended to wipe away a stray tear. I told her I was so scared and confused by everything that had happened. I told her I did not understand why she hated me so much when all I ever wanted was her love. I leaned forward and looked directly into her eyes with fake desperation. I asked her to tell me about the night I was born. I asked her to tell me how she felt when she first held me in the hospital, hoping she would offer some small piece of maternal comfort. Valerie relaxed slightly, sensing that my emotional walls were finally crumbling. She truly thought I was just a desperate, pathetic girl craving a mother's validation. Her natural arrogance began to seep through the maternal facade she had constructed. She smiled a tight, nostalgic smile and adjusted her dress. She told me it was a very chaotic night. She said there was a massive storm raging outside, and the hospital was completely overwhelmed with emergency patients from a terrible car crash on the highway. She leaned back against the sofa cushions and crossed her legs, getting completely comfortable in her own web of lies. Her tone became surprisingly boastful as she recounted the events. She bragged about how incredibly easy it was to bypass the main security desk during the storm. She said the nurses were so distracted by the bloody trauma victims that no one even noticed a wealthy, respectable woman walking down the empty maternity ward hallway. She casually told me she had just lost her own baby that week, and she felt the universe owed her a replacement for her suffering. She described finding the newborn nursery completely devoid of medical staff. She said she simply walked right in, picked me up from the clear plastic bassinet, and carried me out the back stairwell without anyone stopping her. She actually laughed a cold, bitter laugh as she recalled how stupid the hospital security guards were that night. She said nobody ever questioned her because she looked like she belonged there. She sat there in my hotel suite and proudly confessed to a federal kidnapping because she honestly believed I was too ignorant and broken to understand the magnitude of what she was saying. I let her finish her twisted story. I let the silence hang in the air for a long, heavy moment while she smiled at me expectantly. Then the fake vulnerability completely drained from my face, leaving behind nothing but cold, hard determination. I sat up straight and looked at the certified check on the table. I told her to keep her dirty money. Valerie frowned in confusion and pushed the paper closer to me, telling me to stop being stubborn and just sign the waiver so we could both move on with our lives. I slowly raised my hand and pointed a steady finger toward the large wooden bookshelf standing directly behind her shoulder. There was a small, dark recording device nestled discreetly between two thick, hardcover books. A tiny red light was blinking steadily in the center of the device, capturing every single second of our interaction. I smiled at Valerie. My voice was completely devoid of emotion when I finally spoke to her. I told her to smile for the hidden camera. I told her the Federal Bureau of Investigation absolutely loves a good birth story, and her detailed confession was currently broadcasting directly to a secure server monitored by my lawyers. Valerie's face drained of all color in an instant. Her perfectly moisturized skin turned a sickly shade of pale gray. She whipped her head around and stared at the blinking red light on the bookshelf. Her mouth opened in silent, sheer horror as her brain processed my words. The realization of what she had just done crashed down upon her shoulders like a ton of bricks. She had just handed her victim a fully recorded, verified confession of a major federal felony. She jumped up from the velvet sofa so fast she knocked her expensive designer handbag onto the floor, spilling her cosmetics everywhere. She did not even bother to bend down and pick up the check or the legal waiver she needed so desperately. She backed away from me, stumbling over her own feet in her high heels. Her eyes were wide with pure, absolute terror. She turned and sprinted toward the door, ripping it open and fleeing down the hotel hallway without looking back once. I sat calmly on the armchair and listened to the sound of her frantic footsteps fading away into the distance. The trap had snapped shut flawlessly. Desmond and Valerie were now legally and criminally cornered with no way out. Just as I reached over to pick up the abandoned legal waiver, my encrypted phone buzzed loudly on the glass coffee table. It was Harrison. He did not call me to chat, he simply sent a secure encrypted file directly to my inbox. I opened the message and scrolled through the attached financial documents. My cold smile widened into a full triumphant grin as I read the numbers. Preston was drowning fast. The catastrophic fallout from the disastrous $50 million art gallery ambush had backed him into a desperate corner. The gallery owner was threatening to destroy his entire business reputation and sue him into oblivion for the massive staging and security debts he had incurred. Preston needed liquid cash immediately, and Desmond had already cut him off entirely to save his own sinking ship. According to the banking alerts Harrison had just intercepted, Preston had made a fatal, unrecoverable mistake in his panic. Blinded by greed and fear, Preston had secretly bypassed the financial security protocols on his own wife's banking accounts. He was actively embezzling millions of dollars directly from Chantel's private trust fund to cover his own humiliating failures. He was stealing directly from the golden child to save his own skin. Harrison had handed me the exact irrefutable proof of the wire transfers and the offshore routing numbers. The perfect Caldwell family was built on a fragile foundation of lies, and now the rats were finally starting to eat each other alive to survive the flood. I locked my phone screen and stood up from the armchair. The destruction was spreading perfectly according to plan, and I was ready to watch the next pillar crumble. The morning sun poured through the massive bay windows of the elite Buckhead Country Club. The dining room was a sea of crystal chandeliers and crisp white linen tablecloths. Soft jazz played in the background, masking the quiet murmurs of wealthy Atlanta socialites eating their weekend brunch. I sat at a private table near the garden terrace, feeling a sense of absolute control that I had never experienced before. I was wearing a tailored emerald green dress that complemented the rich dark tone of my skin. I had left the back of my neck completely bare, allowing my crescent moon birthmark to show proudly. Sitting around the table with me were four of the most powerful financial executives on the East Coast. They were Lawrence Sterling's trusted associates, and they treated me with a level of deep respect that I had never received from the Caldwell family. We were discussing the final stages of our corporate takeover over plates of smoked salmon and fresh fruit. Everything was moving perfectly according to plan. Just a few tables away, my sister Chantel was hosting a lavish brunch for her closest friends. She had reserved the largest table in the center of the room, making sure everyone could see her. She was wearing a blindingly bright pink designer outfit, and her hair was styled in elaborate curls. She was holding a glass of champagne and laughing loudly, making sure her voice carried across the dining room. Preston sat next to her, looking entirely out of place. His face was pale and he kept wiping sweat from his forehead. He was constantly checking his phone and shifting nervously in his chair. Chantel did not seem to notice her husband's panic. She was too busy soaking up the attention of her wealthy friends. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water and listened as Chantel's voice drifted over to our table. She was bragging about the gala. She was telling her friends how Desmond had officially named her the sole heir to the $185 million Caldwell empire. She spoke with pure arrogance, boasting about the new vacation homes she planned to buy and the luxury cars she was going to order. My father finally got rid of the dead weight. Chantel laughed, taking another sip of her drink. Naomi was always such an embarrassment. She showed up to the gala in a cheap dress and threw a massive tantrum when my father put her in her place. We kicked her out into the rain, and we have not heard from her since. She is probably working at some fast food drive-thru right now, trying to pay her rent. It is honestly a relief. Now I do not have to pretend to care about her anymore. Her friends giggled and raised their glasses in a toast to Chantel's new fortune. I did not flinch. I just smiled and cut a piece of my salmon. The executives at my table exchanged knowing glances. They knew exactly who I was, and they knew exactly what I was about to do to the woman sitting across the room. Preston, on the other hand, looked like he was going to be sick. He knew that the $50 million art laundering scheme had collapsed. He knew that the gallery owner was demanding immediate payment. And most importantly, he knew that he had secretly drained Chantel's private trust fund to save himself. He was sitting right next to his wife, knowing that her accounts were completely empty. He was just waiting for the bomb to drop. The bomb arrived in the form of a polite waiter carrying a black leather checkbook. The waiter approached Chantel's table and handed her the bill for the extravagant brunch. It was easily a $2,000 tab. Chantel did not even look at the receipt. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her exclusive black credit card. She handed it to the waiter with a dismissive wave of her hand. The waiter bowed slightly and walked away to process the payment. I leaned back in my chair and watched the clock. 5 minutes passed. The waiter returned, but he did not have a pen for Chantel to sign the receipt. He was accompanied by the general manager of the country club. The manager looked incredibly uncomfortable. He leaned down and whispered something quietly into Chantel's ear. Chantel's confident smile vanished instantly. "What do you mean it was declined?" She snapped, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet dining room. "Try it again. You obviously ran it wrong." The manager kept his voice low, trying to maintain the peace. Ma'am, we have tried running the card 3 times. The bank has placed a hard freeze on the account due to insufficient funds. Do you have another form of payment? Chantel's face turned bright red. Her friends stopped laughing and stared at her in awkward silence. Preston gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. Chantel frantically dug into her purse and pulled out 2 different platinum credit cards. She slammed them onto the table. Run both of these, she demanded. My father just gave me control of $185 million. There is no way my accounts are empty. You are making a mistake and I am going to have you fired. The manager took the cards and walked away. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my mimosa. I knew exactly what the manager was going to find. Harrison had intercepted the bank alerts late last night. Preston had completely gutted every single one of those accounts to cover his tracks. There was not a single penny left. 2 minutes later, the manager returned. He placed the cards back on the table and shook his head. I am very sorry, Mom, but all of your associated accounts are returning a 0 balance. We cannot process this transaction. Chantel stood up from her chair so fast it tipped over and crashed onto the floor. The loud noise drew the attention of every single person in the dining room. She was breathing heavily, her eyes wide with shock and humiliation. She looked at her friends who were now whispering to each other. She looked at Preston, who was staring at the floor, refusing to meet her gaze. Then her eyes darted across the room and landed directly on me. She saw me sitting there in my custom-tailored dress, dining with men who radiated wealth and power. She saw the calm, knowing smile on my face. Her shock instantly morphed into pure, unadulterated rage. She convinced herself that I was the only person who could have done this to her. She thought I was seeking petty revenge for the gala. She stormed across the dining room, her high heels stomping against the hardwood floor. She marched right up to my table and slammed her hands down on the crisp white linen. "You jealous, ugly freak!" Chantel screamed, her face contorted with fury. "What did you do to my money? I know you did this. You hacked my accounts because you are a bitter loser who cannot stand the fact that my father chose me over you. Give me my money back right now before I call the police and have you arrested for theft." The executives at my table stopped eating. They looked at Chantel with absolute disgust. I did not raise my voice. I did not lose my composure. I reached into my leather briefcase resting on the chair beside me. I pulled out a thick manila folder and placed it gently on the table. I looked up at my sister and spoke with a cold, terrifying calm. "I did not touch your money, Chantel," I said smoothly. "But your husband did." Chantel's eyes darted from my face to the folder. "What are you talking about?" I pushed the folder across the table toward her. "Open it," I challenged. Chantel snatched the folder and ripped it open. Inside were copies of the official wire transfers and bank routing numbers that Harrison had secured. I watched her eyes scan the pages. I watched her read the exact amounts that had been drained from her personal trust fund and routed directly to an offshore account controlled by the Vanguard Fine Arts Gallery. I watched the reality of her husband's betrayal crash into her mind. "Preston has been lying to you and Desmond for months." I explained, my voice carrying clearly across the silent dining room. "He makes terrible investments and loses millions. Yesterday morning, he tried to buy a forged collection of European paintings to launder Desmond's money to Switzerland. I was the forensic appraiser who caught him. The investors backed out, and Preston was left with a massive debt to the gallery owner. Desmond cut him off, so Preston bypassed your security protocols and stole everything you had to save himself." Chantel dropped the papers onto the table. Her hands were trembling violently. She slowly turned around to look at Preston, who had finally stood up from his chair. He was walking toward us, his face pale and desperate. "Chantel, baby, listen to me," Preston pleaded, holding his hands up defensively. "She is lying. Naomi is forging those documents. You know how she is. She is just trying to destroy our marriage because she is miserable and alone. Do not believe her. I would never steal from you." Chantel stared at him. The illusion of her perfect white husband was shattering right in front of her eyes. She did not say a word. She simply reached into her designer pocket and pulled out her smartphone. She opened her private banking app using her facial recognition to bypass the security screen. She tapped the screen once, then she tapped it again. A guttural, agonizing scream ripped from her throat. The screen displayed a negative balance. Every single account linked to her name had been completely drained. The millions of dollars she had bragged about just 10 minutes ago were entirely gone. "You stole from me!" Chantel shrieked, lunging at Preston. "You pathetic lying thief! You took everything!" Preston caught her wrists, trying to push her away. He dropped his loving husband act in a split second. His face twisted into a vicious, ugly snarl. "Get your hands off me, you spoiled brat!" He shouted, his voice echoing through the country club. "I only took what I was owed. I have spent 3 years pretending to care about you and your arrogant father just to get funding for my companies. You are nothing but a shallow idiot who spends money on useless garbage. I needed that cash to save my life." Chantel screamed again and slapped him hard across the face. The sharp crack of her hand hitting his cheek made the other diners gasp in horror. Preston retaliated by shoving her backward. She stumbled and crashed into a nearby serving cart, sending crystal glasses and silverware shattering across the floor. The perfect golden child and her perfect husband were viciously screaming and fighting like wild animals in front of Atlanta's elite. The country club security guards rushed into the dining room trying to pull them apart. Chantel was sobbing hysterically, screaming that her life was ruined. Preston was shouting obscenities, cursing the Caldwell family, and demanding they let him go. I sat comfortably in my chair and picked up my crystal glass. I took a slow sip of my mimosa, watching the beautiful chaos unfold. The dominoes were falling exactly as I had planned. Chantel had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to make herself feel tall. Now she was completely broken, humiliated, and penniless, all because of the man she chose to marry. As the security guards physically dragged a kicking and screaming Chantel out of the dining room, I turned my attention back to the executives at my table. They were smiling quietly, clearly impressed by the flawless execution of the trap. We raised our glasses in a silent toast and returned to our business discussion as if nothing had happened. While Chantel's world was imploding at the country club, a different kind of panic was taking place across the city at the Caldwell corporate headquarters. Desmond was sitting in his massive executive office staring at his computer screens in absolute terror. The corporate credit lines that I had frozen the day before were completely unrecoverable. His contractors were demanding payment. His shareholders were asking questions he could not answer. The $185 million real estate empire was hemorrhaging money at a catastrophic rate, and Desmond was rapidly losing control. He had spent the entire weekend desperately calling every single bank and private lender in his network, begging for a massive loan to keep his business afloat. But word had already spread through the financial sector that Caldwell Holdings was highly toxic. Nobody was willing to risk their capital to save a sinking ship. Desmond was entirely out of options. Just as he was about to collapse from the stress, his private office line rang. He answered it with trembling hands. On the other end of the line was a representative from a mysterious, aggressive venture capital firm called Apex Holdings. Desmond had never heard of them before, but the representative spoke with smooth, professional confidence. They told Desmond that they had been monitoring his current liquidity crisis, and they were prepared to offer him a massive emergency bailout. They promised to inject enough capital to stabilize his entire portfolio and protect his personal assets from bankruptcy. Desmond nearly wept with relief. He thanked the representative profusely, praising their business acumen and promising massive returns on their investment. He thought he had just found his guardian angel. He thought he had just saved his legacy. The representative agreed to the bailout, but stated there was one strict, unwavering condition. The firm required absolute discretion and a rapid closing. They demanded a final in-person signing at exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning at their private downtown offices. If Desmond was even 1 minute late, the deal would be completely off the table. Desmond agreed immediately, swearing he would be there with his legal team, ready to sign whatever paperwork they required. He hung up the phone and let out a loud, triumphant laugh. He believed he was still the untouchable king of Atlanta real estate. He had absolutely no idea that Apex Holdings was a private shell company entirely owned and operated by Lawrence Sterling and myself. We were not offering him a bailout. We were setting the final trap. Desmond was willingly walking straight into the jaws of the beast, and he was going to sign away his entire life on the dotted line. The ultimate revenge was waiting for him on Monday morning, and I was going to be the one holding the pen. The heavy mahogany doors of the Caldwell corporate headquarters were usually a symbol of absolute power. Today, those doors were a symbol of a collapsing empire. Desmond paced back and forth across the expensive Persian rug in his executive office. His tailored suit was wrinkled, and his tie was pulled loosely around his neck. He was sweating profusely. The air in the room was thick with panic and desperation. Valerie sat on the leather sofa with her face buried in her hands. She was crying quietly, the kind of crying that comes from losing everything you care about. She did not care about her family. She only cared about her social status and her bank accounts. Both of those things were currently burning to the ground. Chantel was pacing on the other side of the room. Her face was red and puffy from screaming at the country club. She had lost her perfect husband and her perfect inheritance all in one afternoon. The golden child was finally experiencing the consequences of her own arrogance. She clutched a glass of water with shaking hands. The reality of their situation was crashing down on them. The $185 million real estate empire was completely frozen. Contractors were demanding immediate payment. The bank was threatening to seize their personal properties. Desmond stopped pacing and slammed his fist down on his massive wooden desk. He told Valerie to stop crying and start focusing. He told Chantel to stop acting like a victim and start acting like a Caldwell. He reminded them that they had a meeting on Monday morning with Apex Holdings. He said this venture capital firm was their only lifeline. He said the bailout would save their entire legacy and protect them from total ruin. He believed the lie completely. He had no idea that Apex Holdings was a loaded gun pointed directly at his head. He had no idea my finger was resting on the trigger. Suddenly, the heavy office doors swung open. Preston stumbled into the room looking like a desperate animal. His expensive clothes were disheveled, and his face was bruised from his fight with the gallery security guards. He had just lost his investors, and he was drowning in massive debt. He looked at Chantel and tried to put on a pathetic, charming smile. He told her he was profoundly sorry for what he had said at the country club. He told her he was just stressed out and did not mean a single word of his cruel rant. Chantel glared at him with pure hatred burning in her eyes. She told him he was a disgusting thief and a manipulative liar. She screamed at him to get away from her before she called the police. Preston ignored her anger and turned his desperate eyes toward Desmond. He begged his wealthy father-in-law for a second chance. He told Desmond he knew all about the upcoming meeting with Apex Holdings. He pleaded to be included in the financial bailout deal. He promised he could bring his own business connections to the table to help rebuild the shattered Caldwell empire. He actually got down on his knees and begged for financial salvation like a pathetic coward. Desmond looked down at the white man who had married his golden daughter. Desmond did not feel an ounce of pity or loyalty. Desmond only cared about his own personal survival. He looked Preston directly in the eyes and told him he was a worthless, pathetic failure. He told Preston that the proud Caldwell family does not ever bail out incompetent fools who steal from their own wives. Desmond ordered his private security guards to drag Preston out of the building and throw him onto the street. Preston screamed and cried as the guards pulled him away by his arms. He cursed the Caldwell name and swore they would all live to deeply regret this massive mistake. Desmond simply closed the office doors and locked them tight. There was absolutely no loyalty among these greedy thieves. They were all completely willing to sacrifice each other to save themselves. They were entirely focused on the Monday morning meeting. While the Caldwell family was tearing themselves apart in a desperate panic, I was standing in the center of the beautiful Sterling penthouse. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning panoramic view of the entire Atlanta skyline. The city lights sparkled like brilliant diamonds in the dark evening sky. I was not looking at the gorgeous view outside. I was looking at the massive stack of legal documents spread across the long glass dining table. Harrison stood next to me holding a modern tablet displaying the real-time financial data of the failing Caldwell real estate empire. Every single number on the glowing screen confirmed their rapidly approaching doom. We were meticulously setting the final legal traps to ensure they could never escape. Apex Holdings was a highly secretive private shell company, entirely owned and operated by my true father, Lawrence Sterling, and myself. The complicated documents resting on the table were not designed to bail Desmond out of his current financial crisis. They were specifically designed to forcefully buy his massive corporate debt and legally seize his entire real estate empire from the inside out. Every single page of the contract was filled with binding clauses and ironclad stipulations created by our brilliant legal team. If Desmond signed his name on the dotted line, he would be transferring full legal ownership of Caldwell Holdings directly to me, without even realizing it until it was much too late. I traced my finger over the signature line at the bottom of the final page. I thought deeply about the 29 years of psychological and emotional abuse I had endured under their toxic roof. I thought about the cruel, unforgiving words Valerie had spoken when she ripped the delicate pearl necklace from my neck in front of everyone at the big anniversary gala. I thought about Desmond ruthlessly kicking me out into the freezing rain and disowning me as a public spectacle. I thought about the stolen hospital bracelet and the entire beautiful life they had brutally taken from me, just to satisfy their own malicious desires. My true father, Lawrence, was currently resting in his quiet hospital bed, fully trusting me to reclaim his stolen legacy. I was absolutely not going to let him down. Harrison looked at me and nodded slowly, confirming that the contracts were completely flawless. The trap was perfectly set, and the bait was simply irresistible for a desperate, greedy man like Desmond. Across town, Chantel was sitting alone in her old childhood bedroom, feeling completely powerless and defeated. Her white husband had viciously betrayed her, and her personal trust fund was entirely empty. She desperately needed to feel powerful one last time before the long weekend ended. She wanted to hurt someone to make herself feel slightly better about her ruined life. She immediately thought of me. She remembered that my name was still listed on the lease of the small, cheap apartment I had rented before the disastrous gala event. She knew perfectly well that Desmond had co-signed the rental lease years ago, simply to maintain rigid control over my living situation and finances. Driven by pure malicious spite, Chantel logged into the property management portal using Desmond's administrative credentials. She drafted a harsh, immediate eviction notice, demanding that I completely vacate the apartment before Monday morning. She wanted to render me completely homeless and desperate on the streets. She wanted me to feel the same crushing panic she was currently experiencing. She paid a private courier an exorbitant fee to deliver the physical notice directly to the apartment door, hoping to catch me in a moment of extreme vulnerability. She sat on her plush bed and smiled a cruel, satisfied smile, waiting eagerly for my tearful phone call, begging for mercy and a place to stay. She waited for an hour. She waited for 2 long hours. Finally, her expensive smartphone rang loudly, but it was not me calling to surrender. It was the private courier she had hired. The courier sounded extremely confused and slightly intimidated. He told Chantel that he had arrived at the apartment building, but the main property manager had sternly informed him that I no longer lived there. Chantel frowned deeply and aggressively demanded to know where I had gone. She automatically assumed I was sleeping in a cheap roadside motel or hiding in a local homeless shelter, crying my eyes out. The courier cleared his throat and carefully corrected her arrogant assumption. He said, "Mom, she does not live in this building anymore." The property manager said she completely bought out her lease in cash and moved into the Sterling penthouse downtown. Chantel's blood ran instantly cold. The Sterling penthouse was the most exclusive and remarkably expensive residential property in the entire city of Atlanta. It was a soaring fortress of absolute billionaire luxury that overlooked everything. Chantel dropped her phone onto the bedroom floor. Her perfectly manicured hands were shaking uncontrollably. She could not begin to comprehend what the courier had just told her. The Sterling penthouse was a property that even Desmond Caldwell could not afford to purchase on his absolute best day. It was strictly reserved for the absolute highest tier of global wealth and power. How could the sister she had mocked and brutally abused for 29 years possibly live in a magnificent place like that? Chantel felt a sudden terrifying chill crawl rapidly up her spine. The golden child was finally realizing that the world did not revolve around her. She was finally realizing that the sister she had treated like disposable garbage was entirely out of her reach forever. She ran wildly downstairs to find Desmond and Valerie. She desperately wanted to scream and tell them what she had just learned about my new location, but she stopped dead in her tracks. She found her parents hunched over the large wooden boardroom table, looking utterly exhausted and thoroughly defeated. They were obsessively reviewing the scheduled time and downtown location for the Monday morning meeting with Apex Holdings. They simply did not have the emotional capacity to care about my living arrangements right now. They only cared about saving their own skins from impending bankruptcy. Chantel slowly backed out of the room, feeling completely isolated and terrified of the unknown. The Caldwell family was walking blindly toward Monday morning, expecting a miraculous rescue. They had absolutely no idea that the miracle they were praying for was actually a beautifully crafted guillotine waiting to drop. The weekend passed in a heavy, suffocating blur of severe anxiety for them. For me, the weekend passed with calm, precise, and methodical preparation. I stood quietly by the massive windows of the penthouse, watching the bright sun rise over the city on Monday morning. The early sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange and gold, signaling the dawn of a brand new era. I put on a sharp, tailored black suit that radiated power and picked up my expensive leather briefcase. Harrison was waiting patiently for me by the door, holding a fresh cup of coffee and the final stack of contracts. It was time to go to work. It was time to collect the massive debt they owed my family. It was time to watch Desmond sign his entire life away. The trap was ready to snap shut, and there was nowhere left for them to run. I smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace, knowing the Caldwell empire was about to be erased from history. We walked out of the penthouse and into the private elevator, ready to deliver the ultimate payback. The stage was set for their absolute destruction, and I was going to enjoy every single moment of their spectacular downfall. The reckoning was finally here today. We are extremely ready now. We were extremely ready now. I had barely taken 2 steps toward the private glass elevator when a sudden violent pounding echoed through the grand foyer of my penthouse. The heavy oak double doors shook under the force of someone desperately trying to break them down. Harrison paused and looked at me with a raised eyebrow. We did not have to guess who was causing such a chaotic scene on a Monday morning. Chantel had spent her entire weekend consumed by a toxic mixture of jealousy and blinding panic. She had discovered my new address through the failed eviction notice, and the reality of my wealth had driven her completely insane. She had temporarily teamed up with her estranged husband, Preston. They both hated each other, but they loved money more than they valued their own pride. They were 2 desperate drowning rats who thought they could team up to tear me down. They truly believed there was no logical way I could afford to live in the Sterling penthouse. They convinced themselves that I was either illegally squatting in the luxury property or sleeping with some elderly wealthy sugar daddy to pay my rent. They came to my home with the sole intention of destroying my life one last time. The pounding against the heavy oak doors grew even louder and more erratic. Chantel began screaming at the top of her lungs. Her shrill voice penetrated the thick wood and echoed through my pristine living room. She ordered me to get out of the apartment. She called me a pathetic fraud and a disgusting parasite. She screamed that she knew I was faking my entire lifestyle. Preston joined in, shouting derogatory insults and demanding that I open the door before he kicked it off its hinges. They had managed to bypass the strict lobby concierge by sneaking into the private elevator behind another wealthy resident. They thought they were being incredibly clever and stealthy. They thought they had finally caught me in a massive lie. Chantel yelled through the door that she was currently dialing 911. She proudly announced that she was going to have the police arrest me for trespassing and prostitution. She wanted to make a massive public spectacle. She wanted the local news to report that the disgraced Caldwell daughter was arrested in a high-end building for selling her body. She wanted to completely ruin my professional reputation and drag my name through the mud to make herself feel superior again. I looked at Harrison and simply smiled. I told him not to intervene. I told him to let her call the police. We had a few minutes to spare before our scheduled corporate takeover, and I was more than happy to let Chantel dig her own grave. We stood quietly in the marble foyer listening to them humiliate themselves outside my door. I thought about all the years Chantel had used her status to make me feel small. I thought about the time she falsely accused me of stealing her allowance money when we were teenagers, just to watch Desmond punish me. I thought about the thousands of microaggressions and the blatant racism she directed at me every single day. She had built her entire fragile identity around the false idea that she was inherently better than me. The thought of me possessing more wealth and power than her entire bloodline combined was completely shattering her fragile reality. She could not process it, so she tried to destroy it. 10 minutes passed in agonizing anticipation for them and peaceful amusement for me. Finally, the distinct sound of heavy tactical boots echoed down the private hallway. The local police had arrived. I walked forward and slowly unlocked the heavy oak doors. I swung them open to reveal a scene of absolute pathetic desperation. Chantel was standing there with her phone in her hand, looking like a deranged maniac. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, and her face was red with exertion. Preston stood beside her, breathing heavily and looking incredibly aggressive. 3 uniformed police officers stood behind them, looking stern and ready to make an arrest. Chantel did not even wait for the officers to speak. She immediately pointed a shaking manicured finger right at my face. She arrogantly demanded that the police arrest me immediately. She loudly declared that I was a dangerous fraud who had broken into a multi-million-dollar penthouse. She told the officers that I was a common street worker using the property for illegal activities. She spoke to the police with the immense dripping entitlement of a wealthy white passing socialite who expected the world to bow to her every command. She expected the officers to tackle me to the ground and slap cold steel handcuffs on my wrists. The lead officer stepped forward and raised his hand to silence her frantic screaming. He maintained a calm, professional demeanor. He looked at me and politely asked for my identification. I did not argue or raise my voice. I simply reached into my tailored suit pocket and pulled out my solid titanium identification card and handed it to him. The officer inspected it carefully and then pulled out his mobile terminal to check the official city property registry. Chantel crossed her arms over her chest and smirked at me. She thought she had won. She thought this was the exact moment my entire facade would crumble into dust. She whispered to Preston that I was finally going to prison where I belonged. The lead officer tapped his screen a few times and read the official property documents. His expression shifted from neutral professionalism to absolute stern authority. He handed my identification back to me with a respectful nod. Then he turned his attention directly to Chantel and Preston. He did not look at them with the deference Chantel expected. He looked at them like they were common criminals. He spoke in a loud, clear voice that echoed down the luxurious hallway. He informed Chantel that Miss Naomi Sterling was the sole registered owner of the entire residential building. He explicitly stated that I did not just own the penthouse, but I owned the very ground they were standing on. He then informed them that they had illegally bypassed building security and were currently trespassing on a private property. The smug, triumphant smile completely melted off Chantel's face. Her jaw went slack and her eyes widened to the size of saucers. She stared at the police officer in absolute sheer disbelief. She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. Her brain simply could not process the magnitude of the truth. She looked at me standing there in my immaculate tailored suit, radiating wealth and untouchable power. The reality of her devastating failure finally crashed down upon her. Preston immediately panicked. His cowardice flared up and he instinctively took a step back, trying to distance himself from his wife. He tried to tell the officers that he was just accompanying Chantel and had no idea they were trespassing. He tried to throw her under the bus to save his own skin, just like he always did. The lead officer was not interested in their pathetic excuses. He pulled a pair of heavy metal handcuffs from his duty belt. He told them both to place their hands behind their backs. Chantel completely lost her mind. She started thrashing and screaming as the officers grabbed her arms. She shrieked that her father was Desmond Caldwell and that she was a millionaire heiress who could not be arrested. She threatened to sue the entire police department and have them all fired. The officers ignored her empty threats and forcefully snapped the metal cuffs securely around her wrists. Preston tried to resist, but a second officer quickly pinned him against the wall and cuffed him as well. The elegant, peaceful atmosphere of the luxury building was completely shattered by their loud, desperate wailing. The officers grabbed them by their arms and began marching them down the hallway toward the service elevator. I stepped out of my doorway and followed them at a leisurely pace. I wanted to witness every single second of their public humiliation. The officers dragged the kicking and screaming couple out of the elevator and into the grand lobby of the building. The lobby was filled with some of the wealthiest and most influential residents in Atlanta. Morning commuters heading to their corporate offices stopped dead in their tracks to watch the spectacle. Chantel and Preston were forcefully paraded past the judging eyes of the exact social elite they worshipped so desperately. People whispered and pointed at the disgraced golden child. Her mascara was running down her face in thick black streaks, and her designer clothes were disheveled. She looked absolutely unhinged and thoroughly pathetic. Preston kept his head down, trying to hide his face from the onlookers, but his shame was absolute and undeniable. I did not follow them out the front doors. I turned around and took the private elevator back up to my penthouse. I walked straight out onto my expansive glass balcony and looked down at the street below. The cold morning wind whipped through my hair as I leaned against the railing. I watched from high above as the police officers shoved Chantel and Preston into the cramped back seat of a marked police cruiser. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated their tear-stained faces through the reinforced glass windows. The doors slammed shut, sealing their fate. I watched the police cruiser pull away from the curb and merge into the busy morning traffic, carrying my abusers away to a cold concrete holding cell. I took a deep breath of the fresh city air. I had just effortlessly swatted away a minor annoyance. Now it was time to slay the real monster. I turned back inside and nodded to Harrison. We headed for the door to finish the war. While Chantel was being fingerprinted and booked into a county jail, Desmond Caldwell was sitting in the grand conference room at his corporate headquarters. He was wearing his best power suit and his silver watch. He had spent hours perfectly grooming his appearance to project absolute confidence and stability. He sat at the head of the long, polished table surrounded by his frantic, exhausted legal team. The massive 500-page bailout contract from Apex Holdings rested heavily on the table in front of him. Desmond's hands were sweating, but he masked his anxiety with a forced, arrogant smile. The representative from Apex had told him that this was his one and only chance to save the Caldwell legacy. Desmond was completely blinded by his own massive ego and his desperate need to maintain his lavish lifestyle. He was so terrified of losing his status that he completely abandoned his usual meticulous business practices. His lead attorney nervously pushed his glasses up his nose and warned Desmond that they had not been given enough time to properly review the complex stipulations hidden deep within the massive document. The attorney pleaded with Desmond to wait just one more day so they could comb through the fine print and ensure there were no hidden traps. Desmond aggressively slammed his hand down on the table and silenced his lawyer. He yelled that they did not have another day to waste. He shouted that his credit lines were entirely frozen and his contractors were threatening to seize his commercial properties by noon. He looked at the thick stack of papers and saw nothing but a golden lifeline thrown by an anonymous savior. He grabbed his expensive fountain pen and eagerly flipped to the final page of the document. Desmond did not read a single word of the deeply buried fine print. He did not see the ironclad clauses that legally transferred complete control of his voting shares. He did not see the stipulations that liquidated his personal assets to cover his outstanding corporate debts. He did not see that the anonymous savior was actually his worst nightmare coming to collect. Desmond gripped the pen and swiftly signed his full name on the dotted line. He pressed down hard, leaving a permanent mark of his own spectacular arrogance on the paper. He threw the pen down and leaned back in his leather chair, letting out a loud, triumphant laugh. He smiled a wide, greedy smile, completely convinced that he had just brilliantly outsmarted the entire financial sector. He thought he had won the game and secured his empire forever. He had absolutely no idea that he had just signed his own execution warrant and handed the entire kingdom directly to me. Desmond looked around the quiet conference room, feeling an overwhelming sense of self-satisfaction. He truly believed he was untouchable. He believed that his sharp business acumen and his relentless ambition had saved his family from total ruin. He completely dismissed the warnings of his legal team, viewing them as weak and overly cautious men who did not understand the bold, decisive actions required to run a massive empire. He stood up from the table and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking his corporate campus. He stared down at the sprawling buildings that bore his name, feeling an intense surge of pride. He thought about the legacy he was building and how he would pass it down to his beloved daughter Chantel. He had no idea that Chantel was currently sitting in a cold, damp holding cell, wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, and crying hysterically as her mugshot was being processed. He had no idea that Preston was desperately trying to secure a public defender because his personal bank accounts were completely drained. Desmond smoothed his tie and checked his reflection in the dark glass of the window. He was a man who had built everything on a foundation of lies and theft, but he had repeated those lies to himself for so long that he actually believed he was a self-made genius. He believed that he had rightfully earned every single dollar he possessed. He completely erased the memory of Lawrence Sterling from his mind. He justified his horrific actions from 29 years ago by telling himself that the business world was a cruel jungle where only the strongest predators survived. He thought he was the ultimate apex predator. He did not realize that a much larger, much more dangerous force had been quietly circling him in the dark, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The heavy oak doors of the conference room remained closed, isolating Desmond in his temporary bubble of false victory. He instructed his lead attorney to immediately file the signed paperwork with the state corporate registry to finalize the capital injection. He demanded that his public relations team draft a massive press release announcing the successful stabilization of Caldwell Holdings. He wanted the entire city of Atlanta to know that he had weathered the storm and emerged even stronger than before. He wanted to rub his success in the faces of all the bankers who had refused to loan him money over the terrible weekend. He was preparing to throw another lavish celebration to cement his status. He turned away from the window and walked back to the conference table, completely unaware of the devastating storm that was rapidly approaching his doorstep. The ink on the bailout contract was slowly drying, permanently sealing his fate in legally binding terms. Every single asset, every single property, every single dollar he claimed to own was now legally preparing to transfer into the Sterling family trust. The trap had been executed with absolute flawless precision. He smiled one last greedy, arrogant smile. The stage was perfectly set for the final act, and I was on my way to drop the curtain on his miserable stolen life. Let the final destruction begin. The massive corporate ballroom at the Caldwell headquarters was completely transformed into a spectacle of unearned victory. Desmond had spared absolutely no expense to throw his lavish recovery gala. He wanted to project an image of absolute dominance to the local media and his wealthy investors. The room was dripping in false luxury and desperate arrogance. Hundreds of pristine white orchids cascaded from the high vaulted ceiling, and delicate crystal glasses clinked together in constant nervous celebration. The lighting was perfectly dimmed to hide the cracks in their perfect facade. Desmond stood near the main stage, wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that cost more than most people earned in a year. He looked incredibly arrogant and entirely pleased with himself. He truly believed he had brilliantly outsmarted the entire financial sector by securing the massive emergency bailout from Apex Holdings. He thought his $185 million real estate empire was safe forever. He believed he had won the war. Valerie and Chantel were parading proudly around the ballroom, acting like absolute royalty. Chantel was wearing a blindingly bright red designer gown that screamed for attention. Her hair was perfectly styled in elaborate curls, and she was laughing loudly, making sure her voice carried across the room. She had completely forgotten about the humiliating public arrest at my penthouse just a few short days ago. Desmond had quickly bailed her out of the county jail and assured her that their new financial partners would make all of her legal and financial problems disappear permanently. Preston, her treacherous husband, was nowhere to be seen tonight. He was completely exiled from the family and left to rot in his own massive, insurmountable debt. Chantel did not miss him at all. She only cared about her restored wealth and her restored social status. Valerie was holding a tall glass of expensive imported champagne and boasting loudly to the other wealthy wives about the incredible resilience of the Caldwell family. She was telling anyone who would listen that her husband was a financial genius who could weather any corporate storm. They were all completely blinded by their own relentless greed and their obsession with public image. They walked around the room soaking up the false praise of their equally shallow friends. They had absolutely no idea that they were currently celebrating their own impending execution. They thought the worst was behind them, but the storm was only just gathering its true strength. Desmond stepped up to the main podium. He puffed out his chest and smiled brightly, ready to deliver his crowning glorious achievement to the world. "Ladies and gentlemen," Desmond announced proudly, his voice filled with arrogant, dripping pride. "It is my absolute distinct honor to introduce the true savior of our great company. Please put your hands together and give a warm welcome to the Chief Executive Officer of our new parent company, Apex Holdings." The crowd began to clap enthusiastically. The massive overhead spotlight swung away from the main stage, cutting through the dim lighting of the grand ballroom like a sharp blade. The bright white beam swept over the heads of the confused, wealthy guests and landed directly on the grand sweeping staircase at the back of the room. Desmond stood at the podium with a greedy, expecting smile plastered across his face. He was waiting for his anonymous billionaire savior to descend those carpeted steps. He had absolutely no idea that the spotlight had just illuminated his ultimate destruction. I stepped forward into the blinding circle of light. I did not rush. I stood at the top of the grand staircase and let every single person in that room take a long, careful look at me. I was wearing a stunning custom-made deep emerald green gown that trailed elegantly across the polished marble floor behind me. The rich, vibrant color perfectly complemented the dark tone of my skin, a skin tone that Valerie had spent my entire life criticizing. But the most important and devastating detail was resting heavily against my collarbone. I was wearing the legendary multi-million-dollar sterling family diamond necklace. It was a massive, brilliant piece of custom jewelry that caught the bright light from the crystal chandeliers overhead and essentially blinded everyone in the room. The diamonds sparkled with the weight of my true legacy. I had specifically left my dark hair pulled back into a tight, elegant bun, so the dark crescent moon birthmark on the back of my neck was clearly visible to the entire world. I was no longer hiding who I truly was. I placed my foot on the first step and began my descent. The heavy silence in the ballroom was profound. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic click of my heels against the stairs. The wealthy socialites and powerful investors parted instantly, creating a wide, clear path for me to walk through the center of the room. Valerie noticed me walking toward the stage, and her face instantly turned a sickly shade of pale gray. Her fake, polite smile dropped completely, and her eyes filled with pure, burning hatred. She marched aggressively toward me, blocking my path to the stage. "What do you think you are doing here?" Valerie hissed aggressively, keeping her voice low so the surrounding reporters would not hear her outburst. "Security guards, get over here right now and throw this pathetic trash out onto the street where she belongs." The head of corporate security, Marcus, immediately stepped out from the dark shadows and walked briskly toward us. Valerie smirked, expecting him to violently grab my arms and drag me out of the building. Instead, Marcus stopped right in front of me, placed his hands carefully behind his back, and respectfully bowed his head to me in a clear public gesture of profound, absolute respect. He then turned around and stood firmly by my side, facing Valerie with a stern, highly protective expression on his face. Valerie gasped loudly in pure shock, taking a stumbling step backward. "What are you doing, Marcus? I gave you a direct order." I looked directly into Valerie's terrified eyes and let a cold, deeply satisfied smile spread across my face. "They do not work for you anymore, Valerie," I said, my voice perfectly calm and relentlessly steady. "I bought the entire private security firm yesterday afternoon. Every single guard in this building answers directly to me now. You have absolutely no power here." Chantel's jaw dropped wide open in sheer disbelief. She looked frantically from me to Marcus and back again, completely unable to process the terrifying reality of what was happening. I brushed past her completely paralyzed form and gracefully climbed the short flight of stairs leading up to the main stage. I walked directly toward Desmond. He stood completely frozen, his fake triumphant smile slowly melting off his face, leaving behind a mask of deep confusion and rising panic. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Are you out of your mind?" Desmond snarled, his voice a harsh, desperate whisper meant only for me to hear. "Get off my stage right now before I have you thrown into a police car. You are ruining the most important night of my life." I did not stop walking. I did not shrink away from his anger like I had done for the past 29 years. I stepped right past him, brushing his shoulder with my emerald gown. I walked directly up to the microphone standing in the center of the stage. I reached out and firmly tapped the metal mesh of the microphone twice. The sharp, amplified sound echoed through the massive speakers, silencing the remaining whispers in the crowd. 500 pairs of eyes were completely locked on me. I looked out over the sea of faces, and then turned my head slightly to look at Desmond, who was now standing awkwardly beside me. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Holdings," I said, my voice perfectly calm, smooth, and coated in absolute authority. The words rang out through the grand ballroom, striking the audience like a physical blow. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Desmond stumbled backward as if I had just punched him in the chest. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His brain was violently rejecting the information. He shook his head frantically, his perfectly groomed appearance unraveling by the second. "That is impossible," Desmond stammered, his voice caught by the microphone and broadcast to the entire room. "You are nothing. You have no money. You are just a bitter child telling lies to get attention." Someone cut her microphone. I smiled a cold, hollow smile. I reached into the hidden pocket of my gown and pulled out a small black remote control. I held it up for him to see. "I am not telling lies, Desmond," I replied softly. "I am simply returning the favor. You spent my entire life presenting a false image to the world. Tonight I am going to show them the truth." I pressed the first button on the remote control. The massive digital projector screens hanging on the wall directly behind Desmond instantly lit up. The bright screens illuminated the stage, casting a harsh white glow over his terrified face. The first image appeared on the screens in high definition. It was a scanned copy of a set of heavily aged legal documents and complex software schematics. The documents were dated 29 years ago, and they clearly bore the official signature and personal seal of Lawrence Sterling. Next to the original documents was a modern financial audit tracing the exact origin of Caldwell Holdings' core technology. I looked out at the audience of elite investors and corporate partners. Many of them were Desmond's closest business associates. The empire that Desmond Caldwell claims to have built with his own two hands is a complete fabrication, I announced, my voice echoing powerfully through the room. 29 years ago, Desmond was merely an assistant to Lawrence Sterling. When Lawrence was involved in a tragic car accident, Desmond broke into his private safe and stole the core software patents that launched this entire company. The $185 million legacy you are all celebrating tonight was built entirely on corporate espionage and theft. Desmond Caldwell is not a genius. He is a common thief. The ballroom erupted into loud, frantic murmurs. Investors pulled out their phones rapidly, texting their legal teams. Desmond spun around to look at the massive screens behind him. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. He reached out blindly, gripping the microphone stand to keep himself from collapsing. "That is fake," Desmond shouted, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "She fabricated those documents. It is a lie." I did not even blink. I pressed the button on the remote control a second time. The image on the massive screens shifted instantly. The stolen patents disappeared and were replaced by the official header of a highly secure private medical laboratory. It was a certified genetic testing report. The names on the document were highlighted in bright yellow for everyone to read clearly. Subject A, Lawrence Sterling. Subject B, Naomi Sterling. The final result was printed in massive bold letters at the bottom of the page. Probability of paternity is 99.9%. For 29 years, I believed I was an unwanted burden, graciously adopted by a wealthy family. I continued, letting my words sink into the silent, horrified crowd. I was told I should be eternally grateful for the scraps I was given. I was constantly reminded that my skin was too dark, and my presence was an embarrassment to the Caldwell name. But I am not a Caldwell. I am the biological daughter of Lawrence Sterling, the very man whose legacy Desmond stole to build this fraudulent empire. People in the audience literally covered their mouths in shock. I could see wealthy wives turning to look at Valerie with expressions of absolute disgust. Valerie was standing frozen near the front row, her expensive champagne glass slipping from her trembling fingers and shattering on the marble floor. Chantel looked like she was going to pass out. Her entire identity was built on being the superior golden child, and she was currently realizing she was nothing but the daughter of a criminal. I was not finished. I had saved the most devastating piece of evidence for last. I looked directly at Valerie, who was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I pressed the button on the remote control for the third and final time. The genetic test results vanished from the screens. A high-definition video file began to play. It was the hidden camera footage from my hotel suite. The audio was crystal clear, blasting through the state-of-the-art sound system in the ballroom. Valerie's face appeared massive and undeniable on the screens behind Desmond. The entire crowd listened in complete dead silence as the recorded version of Valerie sat comfortably on the velvet sofa and arrogantly bragged about her crimes. The speakers broadcast her cruel, slurring voice to every corner of the room. She boasted about how incredibly easy it was to bypass the main security desk during the storm. She bragged about finding the newborn nursery completely empty. She proudly described picking up a grieving mother's baby, carrying her out the back stairwell, and stealing her simply to replace the child she had just miscarried. The video played the exact moment she laughed a cold, bitter laugh, calling the hospital security guards stupid. It played her explicit confession to committing a federal kidnapping just to satisfy her own twisted, selfish desires. The reaction in the ballroom was instantaneous and visceral. It was no longer just corporate shock. It was profound human disgust. Women in the audience gasped and stepped away from Valerie as if she was carrying a deadly disease. Men shook their heads in absolute horror. The elegant, sophisticated image Valerie had carefully cultivated for 30 years evaporated in a matter of seconds. She was publicly exposed as a sociopathic kidnapper who had tortured a stolen child for sport. Desmond dropped to his knees on the stage. His legs could no longer support his weight. He was hyperventilating, gasping for air, as his entire world burned to ashes around him. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic, pleading desperation. I leaned down close to the microphone, bringing my face just inches away from his sweating, trembling form. I delivered the final absolute checkmate. "That massive bailout contract you eagerly signed this morning, Desmond," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that was amplified across the silent room. "You did not secure a corporate lifeline. You were too arrogant to read the fine print. You legally signed over 100% of your voting shares, your personal homes, and your offshore assets directly to me. You just handed me the keys to the kingdom to repay the massive debt you owe my real father. You are officially bankrupt. You own absolutely nothing." Desmond let out a ragged, choking sound, clutching his chest, as the reality of his total ruin crushed him. He had willingly signed his own execution warrant. He had given me everything. Suddenly, a piercing, hysterical scream ripped through the ballroom. It was Valerie. Driven completely mad by the public exposure and the loss of her precious wealth, she lost her mind entirely. She lunged forward, shoving past the horrified guests and sprinting toward the stage. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, feral rage. She reached her hands out, intending to drag me down and tear the diamonds from my neck. Before she could even reach the first step, the heavy main oak doors of the grand ballroom were violently kicked open. The loud crash echoed like a gunshot. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical gear and heavy bulletproof vests swarmed into the room. They moved with terrifying speed and precision, shouting commands that cut through the chaos. The flashing blue and red lights from the emergency vehicles parked outside illuminated the hallway behind them. The final trap had fully snapped shut, and there was absolutely nowhere left for the Caldwell family to run. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom did not just open, they violently exploded inward with a deafening crash that completely shattered the fragile silence of the room. A massive wave of federal agents dressed in dark green tactical gear and heavy black bulletproof vests swarmed into the luxurious space. They moved with a terrifying synchronized precision, shouting loud authoritative commands that instantly cut through the mounting chaos. The bright flashing red and blue lights from dozens of emergency vehicles parked outside the hotel spilled into the hallway, casting frantic shifting shadows across the marble floors. The final meticulously planned trap had fully snapped shut, and there was absolutely nowhere left for the Caldwell family to run. The hundreds of wealthy elite guests who had been sipping expensive champagne just moments ago suddenly screamed in pure unfiltered terror. Men in custom-tailored tuxedos and women in priceless designer gowns frantically scrambled backward, dropping their crystal glasses and pressing their bodies hard against the walls to get out of the line of fire. The illusion of safety and untouchable superiority that the Caldwell family had projected for decades evaporated in a single heartbeat. Desmond Caldwell stood paralyzed on the main stage, his eyes wide with absolute sheer panic. The man who had spent 29 years walking through Atlanta like an invincible king was suddenly reduced to a trembling, pathetic shell of a human being. He took one clumsy, desperate step backward, instinctively trying to flee toward the dark service exit located behind the stage, but his legs completely failed him. Two massive federal agents charged up the stairs, closing the distance in less than a second. They grabbed Desmond violently by his expensive suit jacket and forcefully slammed him face first against the very wooden podium he had used to publicly disown me. The sharp metallic click of cold steel handcuffs, snapping tightly around his wrists, echoed through the microphone, broadcasting his ultimate defeat to the entire silent ballroom. Desmond gasped for air, looking exactly like a trapped, cornered animal who knew its life was over. Valerie realized the absolute severity of what was happening, and she completely lost her mind. She started screaming hysterically, flailing her arms wildly and trying to aggressively scratch the federal agents who quickly surrounded her. A strong female agent grabbed Valerie's wrists and twisted them firmly behind her back, pinning her securely. Valerie's expensive designer gown tore audibly at the shoulder, and her perfectly styled hair fell into a messy, tangled ruin across her sweating face. The lead federal agent stepped onto the stage, holding a thick, heavy stack of official federal warrants. He did not care an ounce about their immense wealth or their high society status. He looked directly at Desmond and Valerie with utter, profound disgust. He spoke in a booming, commanding voice that demanded the attention of every single person in the room. He loudly announced that Desmond and Valerie Caldwell were being placed under immediate federal arrest. He read the specific charges loud and clear, making sure every elite guest heard the undeniable truth: corporate espionage, grand larceny, and the federal kidnapping of a minor. Those heavy, damning words hung in the air, settling over the horrified crowd like a thick, suffocating blanket. The perfect Caldwell legacy was officially exposed as nothing more than a massive, disgusting criminal enterprise. Preston stood frozen near the front of the stage, watching in sheer horror as the federal agents aggressively took down his wealthy parents-in-law. The arrogant white venture capitalist who had poured red wine on my dress and called me a worthless parasite suddenly realized that his own freedom was in critical danger. He realized that the Caldwell name was no longer a golden ticket to unlimited wealth and power. It was a fast-tracked one-way ticket to federal prison. His inherent cowardice immediately completely took over his actions. Preston violently shoved his wife Chantel away from him, pushing her hard enough that she stumbled. He treated her like she was carrying a highly contagious, deadly disease. He took several large, frantic steps backward, putting as much physical distance between himself and the doomed Caldwell family as he possibly could. He threw his hands high up into the air, surrendering completely before any agent even looked his way. He screamed at the absolute top of his lungs, desperate to save his own pathetic skin. He shouted to the federal agents and the watching crowd that he had absolutely nothing to do with these horrible people. He yelled that they were disgusting, deceitful criminals, and he swore he had no idea they were running a fraudulent empire. He pointed a shaking, accusing finger directly at Chantel, who was staring at him in total, devastated shock. Preston screamed that he was calling his lawyers right now and divorcing her first thing tomorrow morning. He threw his own wife under the bus without a single second of hesitation, perfectly exposing his arrogant, opportunistic true colors. He proved once and for all that there is absolutely no loyalty among greedy thieves. He was a parasitic leech who only cared about his own survival, and he was abandoning the sinking ship without a single glance backward. Chantel was left standing completely alone in the center of the chaotic destruction. Her entire reality was violently ripped away from her in a matter of brutal minutes. She was no longer the superior, untouchable golden child. She was no longer the sole heir to a $185 million real estate empire. She was no longer the proud wife of a wealthy, powerful investor. She was now just the penniless, abandoned daughter of two federal felons who were currently being read their Miranda rights on a public stage. The devastating, soul-crushing truth crashed down upon her shoulders, breaking her completely in half. Her knees buckled under the immense weight of her failure, and she collapsed onto the hard marble floor, completely ruining her expensive custom silver gown. The fake, arrogant confidence she had maliciously weaponized against me for 29 long years completely vanished into thin air. She looked up at me, standing tall and victorious above her on the stage. She saw the multi-million-dollar sterling family diamonds resting proudly against my collarbone. She saw the absolute, unshakable power radiating from my perfect posture. She realized that I was the one holding all the cards and she had absolutely nothing left to play. Chantel began sobbing hysterically. Thick black streaks of expensive mascara ran down her cheeks, making her look entirely pathetic and broken. She literally crawled across the hard floor toward the stage, grabbing desperately at the hem of my emerald green dress. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, begging for mercy from the exact woman she had spent her entire miserable life tormenting. "Naomi, please!" she wailed, her voice cracking with raw, pathetic desperation. "Please do not let them do this to us. We are sisters, Naomi. We grew up together in the same house. Please do not let them take everything away from me. I have nothing left in this world." I looked down at the sobbing, pathetic woman gripping my dress with her trembling hands. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or sympathy. I did not feel a drop of the familial obligation she was desperately trying to invoke to save herself. I remembered every single time she had mocked my dark skin. I remembered every single time she had laughed happily while Valerie punished me just for existing. I remembered the cruel, deeply satisfied smile on her face when Desmond publicly disowned me at the anniversary gala. I looked at her with eyes as cold and hard as solid glacial ice. I did not raise my voice. I spoke to her with a quiet, terrifying calm that cut much deeper than any loud scream ever could. I repeated the exact same words they had used to destroy me. "You do not belong in this family portrait, Chantel," I said, staring directly into her tear-filled, desperate eyes. "And like you so proudly said at the country club, this is not your table anymore." I physically pulled the soft hem of my emerald dress out of her desperate, grasping hands. I stepped right over her sobbing, shaking body, refusing to acknowledge her existence for another second. The federal agents hauled Desmond and Valerie off the stage, dragging them roughly and aggressively across the ballroom floor. The Caldwells kicked and screamed, begging their wealthy, influential friends to intervene and help them, but not a single person stepped forward to offer assistance. Their elite social circle simply watched in silent, horrified fascination as the mighty, untouchable empire crumbled into dust right before their eyes. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom were propped wide open, revealing a massive, aggressive swarm of local reporters and paparazzi waiting eagerly in the bright hallway. The bright, blinding flashes of countless cameras illuminated the darkness, capturing every single second of the Caldwells' ultimate public humiliation. The flashing, intense lights reflected off Valerie's ruined, tear-stained face and Desmond's broken, utterly defeated posture. They were forcefully shoved out into the cold night air, heading straight toward the waiting armored police transport vans. The glorious, spectacular ruin of the perfect family was officially complete. The heavy, chaotic noise slowly faded away, leaving behind a profound, stunned, beautiful silence in the grand ballroom. The dark nightmare that had haunted me for 29 long, agonizing years was finally over. The stolen empire was rightfully reclaimed, and the evil perpetrators were facing decades in a cold federal prison. I stood in the absolute center of the stage, breathing in the sweet, undeniable scent of total, absolute victory. The heavy, crushing burden I had carried my entire life was completely, permanently lifted from my tired shoulders. Harrison walked quietly up the wooden stairs of the stage, his polished shoes making almost no sound. He approached me with a warm, incredibly genuine smile lighting up his face. He held his encrypted mobile phone out toward me. The bright screen was glowing softly in the dim light of the recovering room. He looked at me with deep, profound, absolute respect and nodded his head slowly. "Your father is watching the live news broadcast from his hospital suite," Harrison said, his voice thick with raw, powerful emotion. "He saw you take back his stolen legacy. He wants to see you right now." I left the chaotic ballroom behind and rode in the back of the Maybach through the quiet Atlanta streets. The flashing lights of the police cruisers faded into the distance as Harrison drove me back to the secure private hospital. I walked down the long, pristine white corridors of the medical center with a profound and deeply overwhelming sense of absolute peace finally settling over my tired heart. I pushed open the heavy oak door to the suite and stepped inside. Lawrence was already awake and sitting up slightly against his soft white pillows, waiting patiently for my safe return. The medical monitors beeped in a steady, calming rhythm. I walked slowly over to his bedside and looked down at the amazing man who had fought so incredibly hard to finally find me. The multi-million-dollar sterling family diamond necklace felt warm against my skin. Lawrence reached out his frail, trembling hand, and I took it gently in mine. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he looked at me. He told me he watched the entire live broadcast of the gala on his television screen. He saw me stand up to the monsters who stole his legacy. He squeezed my hand tight and told me just how incredibly deeply proud he was of me. He said he was not just proud that I reclaimed our stolen empire, but that I retained my brilliant mind and my unyielding dignity despite 29 years of constant cruel abuse. I leaned down and kissed his forehead, telling him that we were finally going home together. 3 fast months passed since the night the Caldwell legacy collapsed. The swift hand of federal justice completely reshaped Atlanta society. I sat in my penthouse, sipping black coffee and reading the morning financial reports. The news featured a prominent update on Desmond and Valerie Caldwell. They were no longer the untouchable king and queen of the real estate world. They were sitting inside a cold, heavily guarded federal prison, waiting for their final sentencing hearing. The media broadcasted photos of them stripped of their expensive designer clothes and stolen jewelry. They were forced to wear standard-issue bright orange prison jumpsuits. Their faces looked hollow and utterly defeated. Federal prosecutors successfully secured convictions for corporate espionage, grand larceny, and the malicious kidnapping of a minor. They were facing mandatory 20-year sentences behind bars. The luxurious life they had violently stolen from my family was permanently replaced by cold concrete walls. Preston, the arrogant venture capitalist who had poured red wine on my dress, was faring no better. His cowardly attempt to abandon his wife and save his own skin failed spectacularly. The Federal Bureau of Investigation seized his electronic devices during the gala raid. They uncovered a massive trail of financial crimes and handed his files over to the Internal Revenue Service. Preston was under an intense federal tax investigation for his art laundering schemes and extensive corporate fraud. All of his bank accounts and hidden offshore trusts were completely frozen and seized by the government. He was entirely broke and publicly disgraced. He was reduced to living in a cheap, dirty roadside motel on the outskirts of the city. He spent his days desperately calling his wealthy former friends, begging for loans, but every single person refused to answer. He was completely exiled from the privileged world he loved so much. Chantel suffered the most deeply satisfying downfall of them all. The perfect golden child who spent 29 years treating me like garbage had her artificial life completely obliterated. Without the stolen Caldwell fortune to prop up her massive ego, she was forced to face harsh reality. She had absolutely no marketable skills and no college degree. I hired a private investigator to keep tabs on her to ensure she never tried to retaliate. He sent me a photograph of her new daily routine. Chantel was shown working a grueling minimum wage retail job at a cheap discount clothing store in a struggling local mall. She was wearing a faded, ill-fitting uniform polo shirt instead of her custom designer gowns. The photograph captured her snapping angrily at a frustrated customer while she folded cheap polyester shirts on a clearance rack. She looked utterly exhausted, miserable, and thoroughly defeated. The woman who once bragged about her impending $185 million inheritance was now struggling to afford her daily bus fare. My new era officially began. I walked into the massive glass conference room at the newly rebranded Sterling Apex Holdings headquarters. I took my rightful seat at the very head of the long, polished mahogany boardroom table. Harrison and my elite team of executive directors sat around me waiting for my instructions. We were not discussing hostile takeovers or greedy corporate expansions. I picked up my silver pen and signed a stack of legally binding documents. I was finalizing a brand new multi-million-dollar charitable trust fund. I specifically designed the massive trust to fully fund comprehensive educational scholarships for disadvantaged youth and struggling independent art students across the country. I was using the reclaimed sterling fortune to build a legacy of genuine compassion and true creative support. I was making sure no talented child would ever have to suffer in the dark the way I suffered. I walked out onto the private balcony of my new corporate office and looked out over the sprawling, beautiful Atlanta skyline. The warm southern sun illuminated the tall glass buildings, reflecting the bright, undeniable promise of my newly reclaimed life. They spent 29 long years trying to convince me I was nothing but a pathetic, invisible shadow. They thought burying me in the dark would make me disappear forever. What they did not realize was that I was not buried. I was planted. And when you try to steal a throne from someone who built their own crown, you do not just lose the kingdom, you lose absolutely everything.